No sailor wished to be on the hunt for Bismarck, the 800-foot Nazi leviathan gliding through the mist-shrouded waters of the Denmark Strait. A volley from her could send hundreds of men to their graves before they even saw her coming. The only force capable of slaying such a creature was a monster of Britain's own making. The mighty Hood, less a ship than a moving island, her great guns jutting from the hull like spines on a beast. At her helm stood Vice-Admiral Lancelot Holland, a seasoned hunter, steering his ship straight into Bismarck's lair. Only one of them would come out alive. The other would vanish beneath the waves in less than 3 minutes. British sailors could barely make out a thing through the thick mist shrouding their vessels as they cut across the North Sea. Still, none dared look away from the horizon. Somewhere out there, the enemy waited, ready to strike the moment they let their guard down. It had been 2 long years since the war began in 1914, yet an Allied victory was still nowhere in sight. Each day, the Royal Navy fought to maintain its blockade against Germany, and the Admiralty feared it was only a matter of time before its rivals found a way to break through. Suddenly, a group of scouts spotted something in the haze. 2 distant silhouettes, barely visible, yet their turrets still stood out against the fog. If the British hesitated, they might never get another chance to strike. HMS Galatea moved into position and opened fire. It was a miss, and before she could get a chance to unleash a second round, the enemy slipped back into the mist. Every sailor kept eyes fixed on the veil around them, waiting for the feared counterstrike to come. Without warning, the cruiser's entire deck shuddered violently as an enemy shell landed clean on the hull. The Battle of Jutland had officially begun. British Admiral David Beatty had no time to plan the perfect counterattack. He had to hit back hard, and he had to do it now. One by one, his battlecruisers began to fire into the fog, chasing the enemies disappearing around them like ghosts. The Royal Navy's salvos fell wide, and their formation was in disarray, giving the Germans the upper hand. All eyes turned to the battlecruiser HMS Indefatigable as her magazine detonated in a blinding eruption upon being found by enemy fire. Flames were still raging across her decks when her sister ship, HMS Queen Mary, suffered a similar fate, her forward section being blown clean. Beatty's fleet would ultimately be saved by the arrival of the Grand Fleet under the command of Admiral John Jellicoe, whose timely intervention forced the Germans to withdraw before being able to eradicate every last British vessel. The Royal Navy had narrowly escaped a massacre. Still, by the end of the campaign, 3 mighty British battlecruisers had been lost, and if the Allies hoped to hold their naval line, they would need to start rebuilding their strength at once. As the British licked their wounds, they envisioned an entirely new breed of battlecruiser, one with armor strong enough to endure the heaviest enemy fire and still strike back with devastating force. The first attempt to build such a vessel came not long after Jutland, when naval engineers laid down the keel of HMS Hood, a lead ship of the Admiral class. She was going to be unlike anything the Royal Navy had ever produced, boasting a main belt 12 inches thick and turrets wrapped in 15 inches of hardened steel. Although initial testing revealed that even this formidable armor could not make Hood completely invincible, especially if dealt a direct hit to her upper decks, the ship still represented one of the most advanced creations of British naval engineering so far, and the Admiralty was determined to see her completed. Stretching 860 feet from bow to stern, Hood was the largest warship in the world. Her silhouette, with twin funnels and 4 massive twin 381mm guns, was a declaration of power. To bolster her already fearsome arsenal, she carried 12 140mm secondary guns, 4 102mm anti-aircraft guns, and 6 533mm torpedo tubes. As if that weren't enough, Hood also carried a small fleet of naval aircraft, including ferry flycatchers, single-seat biplanes that gave her the ability to scout, hunt, and strike targets, even through fog or across hundreds of miles of open sea. Despite her additional 5,000 tons of armor, Hood could still slice through the water at an astonishing 32 knots, matching the fastest warships afloat. Because of her speed, size, and firepower, sailors across the fleet began to call her the Mighty Hood. Even the Germans admitted that if they ever faced her in open waters, their commanders would have to think long and hard before daring to engage. But no German sailor of the Great War would ever face that choice, as the war ended just 3 months after Hood first touched the sea. In the years that followed, Hood's role was largely ceremonial, serving as a symbol of British naval supremacy, patrolling in peacetime missions without firing a shot. Yet this was not the destiny of a battlecruiser born from the lessons of Jutland, and as Europe once again drifted toward war, the men aboard Hood knew her great guns would not remain silent forever. On September 3, 1939, the voice of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain echoed across the nation's radios. Earlier that morning, the British ambassador in Berlin had issued an ultimatum as Hitler's forces marched across Poland's borders. If Germany did not withdraw their troops from the nation, war would follow. Now Chamberlain confirmed what everyone feared, his tone grim and his words absolute as he declared, quote, "I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany." Hundreds of miles away from Downing Street, the news reached the decks of HMS Hood as she patrolled the North Atlantic. Suddenly, her crew found themselves sailing through waters crawling with an enemy that had just been given the go-ahead to strike without warning. The crew on board Hood had to be careful. The predator they were up against was no longer the fragile German Navy from the post-war years, but the much more menacing Kriegsmarine, a maritime force of over 800,000 sailors at its peak, armed with a growing fleet of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and deadly torpedo boats. Though the Royal Navy remained superior in numbers, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, still feared that Germany's ruthless combat tactics and vicious U-boat wolf packs could end Britain's hopes before the war had even begun. And on the very night Chamberlain's broadcast declared war, the Kriegsmarine proved those fears well-founded. As the sun set on the horizon, the German submarine U-30 spotted a figure in the distance as it sailed across the North Atlantic. Most likely a British battlecruiser, perhaps even the prized HMS Hood. The submarine commander could not confirm the identity of the ship from a distance, yet he did not hesitate before commanding a rapid round of torpedoes to go off. Shells detonated against the vessel's hull, but as the ship began to sink, the Germans realized they had not struck HMS Hood, but rather the passenger liner SS Athenia, carrying over 1,000 civilians making their way to America. Water began to surge into the lower decks, trapping passengers in their cabins and flooding engine rooms. The lifeboats were lowered in chaos as the vessel started her slow descent. More than 100 lives were lost, civilians whose only fault was getting caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, the HMS Hood knew what she was up against. As German attacks continued to spread across the Atlantic, HMS Hood was deployed to escort and protect damaged vessels limping back to port before the Kriegsmarine could finish them off. But in those first weeks of the war, no ship, no matter how powerful, was safe. German patrols and tactics were still evolving, and there was no way to know when or where the enemy would strike next. Barely a month had passed since the outbreak of war, when the sailors aboard Hood began to fear for their lives, as lookouts spotted dark silhouettes slicing across the sky. The enemy had found them. A formation of Junkers Ju-88 bombers, each carrying 5 50-pound bombs, was diving straight toward the British battlecruiser, determined to send the mighty Hood to the bottom before she ever had a chance to strike back at Hitler's fleet. Captain Irvine Glennie barked the order for evasive maneuvers. Sirens blared across the decks as sailors sprinted to their anti-aircraft guns, swinging their barrels skyward and firing rapid bursts that shrieked through the clouds. The gunners managed to scatter the incoming wave, but no direct hits were scored. Hood pushed her engines to full power, spray cascading over her bow as she tried to outpace the bombers. But the aircraft were too fast. Another barrage thundered upward. Another miss. Then a lone Ju-88 broke from the formation, weaving through tracer fire and swooping in low to line up the shot. There was no stopping it. Moments later, the ship convulsed under the impact of a direct hit. One of Hood's torpedo bulges had been struck. Speed faltered, yet the crew kept firing, every gunner refusing to yield. But as more German bombs missed their mark and Hood's relentless fire filled the air, the enemy broke off the attack. HMS Hood would get her chance for revenge against the Nazis in the summer of 1940. Britain had just found itself standing alone against Germany as France became the latest nation to collapse before the Wehrmacht's march. If Axis forces seized the French warships still lying in French ports, the tide at sea could shift decisively in Germany's favor. Yet French officials, fearful of provoking Berlin and losing what little control they still held over their nation, refused to hand them over to the Royal Navy, with French Admiral Darlan decreeing, quote, "To respond to outside interests would lead our territory into becoming a German province. Our former allies are not to be listened to." Weighing his choices, Churchill, now Prime Minister, concluded there was only one path left: denial by force. The task would fall into the hands of British Vice-Admiral Sir James Somerville, who hated the mission from the very minute he was briefed. Operation Catapult, as it was officially known, would have Somerville sail the flagship HMS Hood to the French shore to deliver an ultimatum: sail their fleet to Britain to continue the fight, or to a West Indies port for rapid demilitarization. If they refused, the ships would have to be neutralized one way or another. Hood would be supported by the remainder of Force H, a hard-hitting group composed of an aircraft carrier, 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. None of the sailors on board this vessel wished to fire on former allies. But when the French rejected every alternative and refused to scuttle, there was no choice. Years later, Churchill would call what followed, quote, "a Greek tragedy." Hood and her consorts trained their guns on the line of ships moored at the mole and opened fire. Moments later, the battleship Britannia erupted as her magazines detonated while she tried to get underway. Some French crews answered back, but the British salvos were already destroying their defenses. Hulls were holed, systems failed, and towers of flame and smoke rose over the harbor. Fire was checked only when the surviving ships beached, where their guns fell silent. In the end, 5 French ships lay sunk or crippled, and over 1,000 sailors had lost their lives. It was among the bitterest prices Churchill paid in the war. Naturally, Hitler was furious, and determined on revenge and to break the Royal Navy's will, he turned to an entirely new beast, one powerful enough to challenge the mighty Hood. The Kriegsmarine had been working on a new class of battleships, a design that defied every restriction imposed on Germany after World War I, in order to deliver the largest, most formidable naval creation the Reich had ever conceived. After years of obsessive development, the 40,000-ton monster was finally commissioned in late 1940, marking the beginning of the infamous Bismarck class. At 792 feet long, the ship wasn't quite as large as HMS Hood, yet its firepower quickly earned it a fearsome reputation among British sailors. For its primary armament, Bismarck carried 4 twin 15-inch SKC-34 naval guns, each capable of hurling 1,800-pound shells at nearly 1,900 miles per hour. These were supported by 6 twin 5.9-inch SKC-28 secondary guns, their 25-foot barrels menacing enough to make any sailor think twice before facing her in open water. For protection, Bismarck bristled with over 40 anti-aircraft weapons, an armor rivaling the Hood's already impressive defenses. She even carried 4 Arado AR-196 float planes, ready to launch for reconnaissance missions to help her hunt for distant quarry. When Hitler and his top military staff came aboard for inspection, the Fuhrer couldn't be more pleased. This, he declared, was the ship that would bring Britain's naval resistance crashing down. A plan was set in motion almost immediately. Under Operation Rheinebung, Germany's newest battleship would sail alongside the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen to launch what Hitler hoped would be the most devastating commerce raid of the war, one that could definitively sever Britain's already fragile lifeline. Although the plan was not for Bismarck to immediately go against HMS Hood and the rest of Britain's most powerful warships, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, overseeing the operation, made it clear to his men, if the situation called for it, they had his permission to fire. The operation was to start immediately, as Raeder was eager to launch Rheinebung before the impending Operation Barbarossa, which would draw Germany's focus and resources to the Eastern Front. Admiral Günther Lutyens, commanding the mission, urged him to wait until reinforcements could arrive, but Raeder would not hear it. With Bismarck under his command, he believed he needed nothing else to win the Atlantic, and on May 19, 1941, his vessels slipped into the western Baltic, ready to begin their hunt. Admiral Lutyens hoped to get Bismarck and Prinz Eugen out of European waters by sailing north along the coast of Norway, refueling in Nazi-occupied ports, and then pushing through the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland before descending into the Atlantic Ocean. But before the German ships could get too far, a report reached the British naval attaché in Sweden. Coastal observers have reported sighting 2 large warships heading north. As further aerial patrols were deployed to confirm Lutyens's position, the admiral knew his attempt to break out undetected had failed. Still, intelligence reports suggested that the Royal Navy's home fleet remained docked in port, and so he pressed on, believing his path to the Atlantic remained wide open. But one of Germany's greatest enemies was already closing in. Upon receiving the German sighting reports, Vice-Admiral Lancelot Holland wasted no time in ordering HMS Hood to steer full speed alongside the new battleship HMS Prince of Wales, racing to intercept the German force. Holland's plan was promising: to attack from the west as Lutyens attempted to traverse the Denmark Strait at sunset. The fading light would silhouette Bismarck and Prince Eugen against the horizon, while keeping Hood and her allies concealed in darkness. On paper, it was an elegant strategy, but the moment the British sailors arrived near the Denmark Strait, they immediately knew this would be far from a refined battle. A thick bank of fog had rolled across the strait, swallowing the sea and hiding everything beyond a few miles. To maintain the element of surprise, Holland ordered radio silence. Contact with the formation's accompanying cruisers became intermittent, and their slower speed left them falling behind. Soon, Hood and Prince of Wales were virtually alone in the water, hunting for the most powerful naval war machine the Nazis had ever built. After hours of searching, a lookout aboard Prince of Wales finally spotted movement ahead, a faint shadow, roughly 17 miles beyond them. Visibility was poor. Their front-facing position meant that not all guns could be used, and the distance from the enemy put Hood at significant risk of being dealt a plunging fire, the one weakness her considerable armor could not protect her against if the battle dragged on. However, Holland also knew that hesitation would be fatal. If the enemy slipped away, it would be Jutland all over again, leaving blind gunners firing into the fog, waiting to be hit by the incoming shells of Germans disappearing in the mist. Holland steadied himself on the bridge, eyes fixed on the silhouette ahead, and gave the order to fire. As HMS Hood's guns thundered across the sea, the first salvos landed close enough to the German ships ahead to send geysers of seawater and shards of metal erupting over their decks. But as the British shells crept closer to a direct hit, Vice-Admiral Holland remained unaware that his gunners were actually firing at Prince Eugen, not Bismarck. The German heavy cruiser had taken the lead after Bismarck's radar systems failed, leaving Hood's first volleys trained on the wrong target. Prince of Wales, meanwhile, had correctly sighted Bismarck, but as a newly commissioned battleship, her guns were far from battle-ready. Only minutes into the fight, her crews were already wrestling with mechanical failures, struggling to reload and fire fresh salvos toward the enemy. This gave Lutyens just enough time to decide how to respond. The admiral had hoped to save Bismarck's firepower for her Atlantic commerce raid, but he knew that if the British shells drew any closer, the mission would be lost before it began. This was not the battle the German commander had planned for, but it was the one he would have to fight. One by one, Prince Eugen's and Bismarck's great turrets swung toward HMS Hood. Then the German guns opened fire. The damage was instant. The first hit came from Prince Eugen, her shell striking Hood and igniting a roaring fire along the vessel. Flames tore across the decks as sailors scrambled to contain the blaze while still manning their stations, desperate to keep the ship firing. Aboard Prince of Wales, the crew watched in horror as their sister ship burned. Knowing it was now up to them to turn the tide, they forced their jammed guns back into action. One burst groaned toward the target, firing a shell across the water. The hit smashed into Bismarck's bow, yet falling short of disabling her guns. Holland understood that if Hood was going to have any chance of landing a decisive blow, she would need to change positions. The captain gave the order for Hood and Prince of Wales to begin turning to port, ready to bring every gun to bear on the enemy. By now, the opposing forces were less than 9 miles apart, close enough to give Lutyens his best shot at landing a direct strike from Bismarck. Before Holland's ships could finish readjusting their course, the Germans opened fire again, their salvos darting right toward the hull of HMS Hood. To this day, no one knows precisely how many shells struck HMS Hood, but reports suggest that at least one 15-inch round found its mark near the mainmast. For a moment, Holland and his men stood frozen as they witnessed the hole left by the strike, the world silent except for the echo of the guns around them. Then, without warning, a tower of flame erupted from the center of the ship. The blast tore upward, splitting the sky in two. Some sailors dove for cover as fire raced across the deck, while others rushed for the lifeboats. It was useless. Just seconds after hell had broken loose on the deck of HMS Hood, an explosion detonated, powerful enough to rip the ship clean in half. From his command post aboard Bismarck, Lutyens marveled as he witnessed how the pride of the Royal Navy sank beneath the waves in barely 3 minutes. Along with her went Admiral Holland and 1,415 other men, leaving only 3 survivors. Now alone against the German capital ships, Prince of Wales had no choice but to retreat before sharing her sister's fate. The battleship turned hard and began to flee as enemy shells rained down. One after another struck her hull, crippling her systems until multiple of her guns stopped responding. In a last attempt to save herself, the crew deployed a smokescreen, disappearing behind it as the Germans continued to fire into the haze. Aboard the Bismarck, sailors demanded to pursue the escaping British ship before she could get away. However, Lutyens refused. He had already spent too much firepower for the day. For days, British ships scoured the site where the Battle of the Denmark Strait had claimed their greatest ship, every sailor eager to avenge HMS Hood. But Bismarck had vanished. Reports suggested that after one of Prince of Wales's shells had struck home and ruptured Bismarck's fuel tanks, Admiral Lutyens had been forced to break from Prince Eugen and steer for friendly waters to make repairs, most likely at Brest in occupied France. Yet the Royal Navy's frantic sweeps and radar searches could not pinpoint the exact location of the ship. Reconnaissance planes were sent out to look for the Bismarck visually. At first, pilots didn't have better luck. But just as hope was beginning to fade, the Catalina flying boat, sweeping low over the Atlantic, caught sight of a faint ribbon of oil stretching east toward France. The Bismarck had just passed through these waters. The race was on. The German battleship was dangerously close to the shore. If she reached France, she would be untouchable. The Admiralty immediately ordered a full strike force to intercept. The hunt would be led by Vice-Admiral James Somerville's Force H, the same fleet that had once commanded HMS Hood to strike the compromised French vessel trapped in the country after the Nazi invasion. The moment Somerville's group was close enough to the Bismarck, he ordered squadrons of Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers to lift from the runways of the carrier HMS Ark Royal. Although not the most modern aircraft the Royal Navy had to offer, the bombers braved through Bismarck's anti-aircraft fire, weaving through the tracer bursts until they were close enough to strike. As their torpedoes came down, one found its mark, smashing into Bismarck's stern and jamming her rudder, leaving the vessel stuck at sea. With the German ship disabled, the British had enough time to close in, and soon the battleships King George V and Rodney, followed by a wall of heavy cruisers, were already descending on the wounded beast. Lutyens gave the order to fire, but without steering, his guns could not find their mark. The Royal Navy did not wait to hit back. Shells crashed into Bismarck's hull from every direction, tearing through steel, shredding decks, and silencing her turrets one by one. Fires consumed the ship from bow to stern, until finally her mighty frame began to list and sink beneath the waves. Admiral Lutyens went down with his command, along with more than 2,000 of his men. By the time the smoke cleared, the Bismarck, the terror of the seas, was gone, and the Royal Navy had avenged the mighty Hood.